Welcome back, traveller. Before tonight's mystery begins, if you enjoy these stories, a like and subscribe helps me make more of these late-night tales. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. The rain had been falling on London for 3 days straight. Not the dramatic rain of storms, no thunder, no wind, just the grey, relentless kind that settles in from the north in November and refuses to leave. It turned the streets to mirrors. It drove the cab horses to put their heads down. It made every doorway in the city a temporary shelter for someone who hadn't expected to need one. I arrived in it, which was typical. One moment I was somewhere else entirely, and the next I was standing in the middle of Cavendish Square. Rain hitting the shoulders of my coat, the water already finding the back of my collar. The square was quiet. The great houses around its perimeter had their curtains drawn. The central garden, iron-railed and locked, stood dark and wet under a sky the colour of old pewter. Harley Street was a minute's walk to the west. I knew the street. Every educated person in the English-speaking world knew the street, or knew of it. The address that meant medicine of the expensive kind. The consulting rooms of physicians who charged a guinea a visit and saw the right sort of patient. The street where you went when you could afford to be properly ill. I walked to it, and I turned into it, and halfway along, I found what the city had brought me to. 3 carriages stood in the road outside a tall Georgian townhouse, their horses patient in the rain. One of the carriages had Metropolitan Police stenciled on its side in gilt letters. 2 uniformed constables stood at the front door, which was open, rain blowing across the threshold. A small crowd of residents from adjacent houses had gathered on the opposite pavement, their umbrellas touching like a city of mushrooms, watching the door with the alertness of people who are witnessing something they will discuss for weeks. I crossed the road and approached the nearest constable. "What's happened?" I said. The constable looked at me with the professional blankness of someone trained to reveal nothing to strangers. Then, behind me, a voice I recognized said, "He's with me." I turned. Sherlock Holmes was standing at the corner of the street, his coat darkened with rain, his face sharp and alert in the way it was when a case had just begun to interest him properly. He carried a small bag. He was already walking toward the house. "The body was found an hour ago," he said, as I fell into step beside him. "The victim is Dr. Theodore Margrave, 62, a physician of considerable reputation with consulting rooms on this street for the past 28 years. The official view is suicide. He left a note. He took poison." Holmes looked at the open door. "The official view is wrong." "How do you know?" "Because," Holmes said, mounting the steps past the constable, "I knew Dr. Margrave, and he was not the sort of man who takes poison and leaves a note. The entrance hall was the kind of entrance hall that costs money to achieve. Black and white marble floor, a staircase with mahogany balusters, oil portraits on the walls, a side table of dark walnut bearing a silver card tray. Every surface spoke of prosperity made respectable by time. There was a smell of beeswax and something medical beneath it, carbolic and the ghost of something sharper. Inspector Lestrade was in the hall, talking to a young man with a doctor's bag who turned out to be the police surgeon. Lestrade saw Holmes, and his expression did the usual thing. The brief resistance, followed by the pragmatic recognition that Holmes being here was better than Holmes not being here. "I had a feeling you'd turn up," Lestrade said. "Where is he?" "Consulting room. Ground floor, rear of the house." The consulting room was at the back of the house. separated from the waiting area by a passage and a heavy door. It was a room designed to project authority and competence. The large desk, the glass-fronted cabinets of instruments, the diplomas and certificates on the walls, the examination couch with its paper cover. Everything in it communicated that serious work happened here. Dr. Margrave was in his consulting chair, behind the desk. He was a large man, had been a large man, with white hair and a grey beard, dressed formally in a dark frock coat. His hands rested on the desk, palms down, as if he had simply stopped in the middle of a consultation. His face was the face of a man who had died in some discomfort, but not in panic. His eyes were closed. On the desk before him sat a small glass, empty, and beside the glass, a sheet of paper. Holmes went straight to the body, examining it with the efficiency of a doctor who has been trained to observe without sentiment. He looked at the hands, the face, the position of the body. He leaned close and smelled the empty glass. He examined the paper without touching it. "Read me the note," he said. Lestrade produced his notebook. I copied it. It reads, "I cannot continue to carry what I know. The weight of it has become insupportable. I have tried to do right and failed. I ask forgiveness of those I have served honestly, and peace for those I have served poorly. God willing, they will understand. Theodore Margrave." Holmes looked at the body for another 10 seconds. "What was the poison?" he asked the police surgeon. "Prussic acid, by the smell," the surgeon said. "We'll confirm at autopsy, but the almond smell from the glass is characteristic. Death would have been rapid, seconds to minutes. And the glass was on the desk, exactly where you see it. He sat down, drank it, and remained in the chair." Holmes straightened and walked slowly around the desk. He looked at the floor on either side. He looked at the window, sash window, closed, latched from the inside. He looked at the door through which we'd entered. He went to the glass-fronted cabinet nearest the desk and examined the contents through the glass without opening it. "The note," he said, returning to the desk. "Is it in Margrave's handwriting?" "His housekeeper confirmed it was," Lestrade said. "She's the one who found him. Came in to tell him his 4 o'clock had arrived, found him like this. She was quite certain about the handwriting. She said she'd seen his writing every day for 12 years. Holmes said, which in his vocabulary meant, "That detail is less definitive than you think." He took from his bag a magnifying lens and examined the note at close range for a full minute without speaking. Then he examined the glass, the desk surface around it, the pen lying in its tray, the ink bottle beside the pen. "Lestrade," he said, "when did the housekeeper last see him alive?" 3 o'clock. She brought him tea. He was at the desk, writing. "Did she see what he was writing?" "She said it was correspondence, letters." "And between 3 and 4, was there a patient?" "His appointment book shows a 3:30, a Mrs. Allerton, but Mrs. Allerton says she never came. She had an appointment, but she was unwell and sent a note cancelling." "Did the cancellation arrive?" Lestrade checked his notebook. "The housekeeper says she doesn't recall a cancellation arriving, but she was occupied in the kitchen from 2:30 onward, preparing for the evening meal." Holmes looked at the desk. He looked at the window again. He looked at the ceiling. Then he turned to me with an expression I had come to recognize, the expression of a man who has found the shape of something important. "He didn't take the poison himself," Holmes said. Lestrade opened his mouth. "The note is genuine," Holmes said, before Lestrade could speak. "It is in his handwriting, and I have no reason to doubt that he wrote those specific words at some point. But he did not write them today. The ink on the note is slightly older than the ink in his pen, and the pen shows very recent use. There is fresh ink at the nib that has not fully dried. He was writing something this afternoon. It was not the note. He went to the window. The window is latched from the inside, he said. But look at the latch. There is a small scratch on the brass that is bright and fresh. New metal exposed. The latch has been recently manipulated from outside. He turned. This window can be reached from the rear garden, which is accessible from the mews behind the house. You're saying someone came in through the window, Lestrade said. I'm saying the room was entered from outside. Whether through this window specifically, or by another means, I cannot yet be certain. But this was not a suicide. Someone gave Margrave the prussic acid, perhaps in his 4 o'clock tea, perhaps in some other form, and then arranged the scene. They placed the empty glass. They left the note, which they had obtained in advance, or found in the room, or had written themselves in a near-perfect imitation of his hand. The housekeeper confirmed the handwriting. The housekeeper is not a document examiner. Holmes was already at the door. I need the appointment book. I need to know the name of every patient Margrave saw in the past 3 months, and I need to speak to the housekeeper myself. The housekeeper was a woman of 60, named Mrs. Pryor, and she had the bearing of someone who has spent her life in service and whose reliability is something she takes seriously. She sat in the kitchen, still shaking slightly from the discovery, with a cup of tea she was not drinking. She looked at Holmes when he came in with the focused attention of someone who understands that what she says matters. His last real appointment was at 2 o'clock, she said. Mr. Carver. He came and went. After that, I brought tea at 3, as I said, and he was at his desk working. He seemed normal, a little preoccupied perhaps, but he was often preoccupied. He had a great many things on his mind. In the past few weeks, Holmes said, had you noticed anything different about him? Any change in his behavior, his hours, his visitors? She was quiet for a moment. He had a visitor last week, she said. Not a patient. He came in the evening, not through the front door, but through the mews entrance at the back. Doctor. Margrave let him in himself. They were in the consulting room for perhaps an hour. I didn't see the man clearly. It was dark in the passage. Can you describe what you did see? Tall, well-dressed, a gentleman's coat. He moved like a man who was certain of himself. Did Dr. Margrave seem distressed after this visit? She pressed her lips together. He seemed frightened, she said quietly. He came out of the consulting room afterwards, and he was the colour of paper. He didn't speak to me. He went straight upstairs, and for the rest of that week, he was not himself. Holmes thanked her and returned to the consulting room. He spent another 20 minutes there while Lestrade's men went about their official business. He opened the glass cabinet and examined the contents carefully. He looked at the fireplace, where a small amount of ash sat in the grate. Coal ash mostly, but something beneath it, less grey, more white. He crouched and examined it with the lens. Paper, he said. Burned paper. Recent. The ash is fragile and the fire hasn't been lit since. He looked at the grate. Someone burned documents in this fireplace. Burned them thoroughly, but not recently enough to make the ash indistinguishable from coal ash. He stood. Here is what I believe happened, he said, to me, as much as to Lestrade. Dr. Margrave was being blackmailed. The evening visitor last week was the blackmailer. Whatever was demanded was either refused or could not be met. And today, the blackmailer returned, through the mews entrance, while the housekeeper was in the kitchen, and killed Margrave to prevent him from speaking. Speaking about what? Lestrade said. That is what we need to find out. Holmes picked up his bag. The appointment book, Lestrade. Tonight. I need it. You'll have it, Lestrade said. We stood in the rain outside the townhouse on Harley Street, and Holmes looked up at the facade for a moment. 28 years, he said. He built all of this over 28 years, and something from before that, something old, came back and destroyed it. He put his coat collar up and walked toward the main road. Baker Street, he said. I have work to do. The sitting room at 221B was warm and lit and smelling of tobacco and the chemical ghost that always attended Holmes's experiments. He had a map of London spread across the table and the appointment book Lestrade had sent by messenger within the hour, and he was working through the names in the book with the same methodical attention he gave to everything. I had learned, in our previous cases together, not to interrupt Holmes when he was in this phase of an investigation. He was reading, not just the names, but the pattern behind the names, the frequency, the gaps, the anomalies. He was reading the appointment book the way a musician reads a score, looking for the thing that didn't belong. I sat by the fire and read the evening papers and let him work. After perhaps 40 minutes, he set down the book. There are 3 patients in the past 3 months, he said, who appear in the appointment record in a way that is not consistent with the others. All 3 are listed under names that give no address. Every other patient has a full address alongside the name. These 3 do not. He slid the book across. Look, November the 3rd, a Mr. Price. November the 18th, a Mr. Price again. December the 2nd, which is 4 days from now, another appointment with Mr. Price. The same Mr. Price 3 times, I said. With no address, no referral noted, no notation about the nature of the consultation, which Margrave marked routinely for all his other patients. Holmes tapped the book. And look at the dates. Every 15 days, with remarkable regularity. Blackmail payments, I said. Regular meetings with someone who is not a patient. Yes. Holmes leaned back. The question is who Mr. Price actually is, because that name is certainly false. He stood. I need to know more about Margrave's history, where he trained, where he practiced before Harley Street, what he might have known that was worth killing to suppress. He went to the shelves where his reference volumes were arranged. Pass me the medical register. The medical register was a large volume published annually, listing every registered physician in Britain. Holmes found Margrave's entry and read it aloud. Theodore Arthur Margrave, qualified 1858, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, practiced in Leeds, 1858 to 1863. Practiced in London from 1863, first address Wimpole Street, moved to Harley Street in 1867. He paused. Leeds, 1858 to 1863. Does that mean something? It may. He set down the register and picked up a different volume, a directory of some kind, which he began leafing through rapidly. There was a case in Leeds in 1861 that attracted some attention. A family named Dunmore. The head of the family, a mill owner quite wealthy, died under disputed circumstances. His physician signed the death certificate as natural causes. Cardiac failure. His family disputed it. There was a coroner's inquest. Holmes found the page he was looking for. The physician who signed the death certificate was a Dr. T. Margrave, then of Leeds. He looked up. The inquest returned a verdict of natural causes, he said. But the Dunmore family never accepted it. There were allegations, never formally substantiated, that the death was not what it appeared, that the physician had been influenced, bribed to misrepresent the cause of death, or compromised in some other way. Holmes set down the directory. The Dunmore family. That is where we begin tomorrow. He looked at the rain-streaked window. Someone who knew what Margrave knew about the Dunmore death, or what he did, used that knowledge for 30 years, and when the arrangement became too dangerous, they silenced him. 30 years, I said. That is an extraordinary patience. It is the patience of someone who needed Margrave alive, Holmes said, until they didn't. He went to the fire and stood with his back to it, warming his hands. The document in the note, he said. I told Lestrade the note was written in advance, but I believe there is something else. The phrase he used, I have tried to do right and failed. That is the language of a man confessing something specific, not vague guilt, a particular guilt. He paused. Whoever obtained that note, whether they found it in Margrave's papers, or whether they had him write it under duress, or whether they copied his handwriting to produce it, they chose it because it sounded like the kind of thing a man in Margrave's position might write. But how would they obtain something he'd written privately? People write things in extremity that they don't send, Holmes said. Letters that are started and abandoned, journals, notes to themselves. Margrave was a man under pressure, under blackmail pressure for at least 3 months, and possibly for decades before that in a different form. It would not be surprising if he had, at some point, committed his feelings to paper, and if someone had access to his rooms through the Mews entrance, they might have found such a document. He looked at me. Tomorrow we go to the British Library and look at the newspaper coverage of the Dunmore inquest, he said. Then we go to Lestrade and tell him what to look for. The British Library reading room was warm and hushed, smelling of old paper and book leather and the concentrated quality of thought that fills rooms where people read important things. Holmes worked quickly through the bound newspapers, finding the coverage of the Dunmore inquest across the Yorkshire papers of 1861. The story was more detailed than I had expected. Edgar Dunmore had been 58 years old when he died. He was a significant figure in the West Riding, a wool merchant and mill owner, a magistrate, a man of the kind of local authority that money and tenure combined to create. He had died in February of 1861 after a short illness, and his physician, Dr. Theodore Margrave, then 26 and in his 3rd year of practice, had signed the death certificate citing cardiac failure. What the newspapers reported was this, that Dunmore's eldest son, Gerald, had engaged a second physician to examine his father's body before burial, and that the second physician had expressed some reservations about the cause of death. A coroner's inquest had been called. Witnesses had been examined. The inquest had ultimately returned a verdict of natural causes, but not before significant testimony about the circumstances of Dunmore's final weeks. Holmes read with the lens in his hand, moving through column after column of closed Victorian print. Here, he said, after 20 minutes. He turned the bound volume so I could read alongside him. The testimony was from a woman named Sarah Grice, identified as a housemaid at Dunmore's residence. She testified that in the week before his death, she had seen a man calling at the house on 2 occasions who she did not recognize. A young man, she said, dark-haired, well-dressed for a young man. He came to the rear entrance. He met with the master in the study, not the drawing room. The rear entrance, I said. Yes, Holmes said, and then look here. He indicated another passage from the testimony of Dunmore's personal secretary. The secretary testified that in the final days of Dunmore's life, a sum of £500 had been withdrawn from the family accounts. The withdrawal was authorised by Dunmore himself. The secretary did not know to whom it was paid. £500. In 1861, that was a significant sum. He was paying someone, I said. He was paying someone, Holmes agreed. And then he died, and the physician signed the death certificate without raising questions. He straightened, and that physician was 26 years old and had something to hide, or something that could be used against him. He closed the bound volume. The person being paid, he said, the person who came to the rear entrance, that person had leverage over Dunmore. Dunmore was paying. Dunmore died. And then, at some point, months or years later, Margrave came to understand what had really happened. Or Margrave had always known, because he had been part of it. He stood. There is a third possibility, he said. Margrave was not the blackmailer's tool. Margrave was the blackmailer's victim. The same person who had leverage over Dunmore, leverage sufficient to extract £500, had leverage over his physician too, and used it for 30 years. We walked back through the rain toward the Strand. Who could have had leverage over both a wealthy mill owner and his young physician? I said. Someone who knew something damaging about both of them, Holmes said. Or someone who manufactured something damaging. Or someone who witnessed something that gave them power over both. He flagged a cab. The family. We need to speak to the Dunmore family. Gerald Dunmore, the eldest son, who had called for the second opinion and the inquest in 1861, was dead. He had died in 1889. But his daughter, a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax, was alive and living in Kensington, and she received us that afternoon in a drawing room that had the settled quality of a place where someone has lived for a very long time and stopped noticing what the furniture looks like. She was in her mid-50s, with her father's dark colouring and a sharpness in her eyes that said she had been expecting something like this for years without knowing exactly what it would look like when it arrived. "You're investigating Theodore Margrave's death," she said, before Holmes spoke. "I am. I read about it this morning." She folded her hands in her lap. "I am not surprised." "Tell me why," Holmes said. She looked at him steadily. "Because of what I believe about my grandfather's death," she said. "I grew up with the story. My father spent years trying to prove that Edgar Dunmore was murdered. He never could. The evidence wasn't there, or the right people had removed it. But he always believed it, and he told me everything he believed." "What did he believe?" "He believed that my grandfather was poisoned," she said. "Not by Margrave directly, but that Margrave knew. That Margrave was pressured to sign the certificate and call it cardiac failure. That someone had something on Margrave, something from Margrave's past, his time before Leeds, that was used to buy his silence." She paused. "And my father believed that the same person who had leverage over Margrave was the person who poisoned my grandfather. But who that person was, he could never determine. Because the person was careful," Holmes said. "Because the person was extremely careful for 30 years, and apparently for another 30 after that." She looked at her hands. "My grandfather had a partner in his business, a man named Carver, Thomas Carver. They had been in business together since the 1840s. When my grandfather died, the terms of the partnership meant that Carver acquired a significantly increased share of the business." Holmes was very still. "Carver," he said. "Mr. Carver was in Margrave's appointment book. He was there yesterday afternoon, his 2 o'clock appointment. Mrs. Fairfax looked at him. He's still alive. He was alive at 2 o'clock yesterday, Holmes said. I don't know his current condition. He rose. I need to go immediately. Thomas Carver lived in a house in Chelsea, and he was alive, and he was at home. And when Holmes presented himself at the door with a card that identified him by name only, Carver's butler admitted us with the slightly over-rapid acquiescence of someone who has been told to admit this caller if he ever came. The drawing room of Carver's house was the drawing room of an old man who had been rich for a long time and had forgotten to be interested in spending his money. The furniture was good and old, the fire was high, and in the chair beside the fire sat Thomas Carver himself, 82 years old, small and very white-haired, with the papery hands of extreme age folded on a rug across his lap. He looked at Holmes and he said, I wondered if you'd come. Tell me about Edgar Dunmore, Holmes said. Carver was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain continued its patient work. I was waiting for 63 years, Carver said. 63 years. And now it's nearly done. He told us. The story was exactly as Holmes had intuited in its broad shape, but the details were different in ways that mattered. Carver had not poisoned Edgar Dunmore. Dunmore had not been poisoned at all. The death had been natural, a genuine cardiac failure. But Carver had used the opportunity of Dunmore's sudden death to falsify certain business records, diverting money from the partnership accounts in the weeks before the death certificate was signed, in a way that would only come to light if someone examined the records very carefully in the period immediately after Dunmore's death. Margrave had examined them, because Margrave had been Edgar Dunmore's physician, but also, it turned out, a family friend with access to the household. He had seen the discrepancy, and he had made the mistake of confronting Carver with what he had found. Carver, who had been 30 years older than the young physician and far more experienced in the ways of using power, had done two things simultaneously. He had paid Margrave not to report the discrepancy, and he had secured, through methods he declined to specify, information about Margrave's time before Leeds, a period at a medical school in Edinburgh, a patient who had died, questions that had been asked and not fully answered, that he held as insurance against Margrave ever deciding that the payment was not enough. He didn't take my money happily, Carver said. He took it because he had to, and he paid for that for the rest of his life. He looked at the fire. Every 15 days, for the past 3 months. He was reliable. He had always been reliable. Something changed 3 months ago, Holmes said. Carver looked at him with the clear, exhausted eyes of very old age. I am dying, he said simply. My physician has given me 3 months, perhaps 4. The payments were becoming irregular. I needed to be certain of his silence before I went. He paused. I went to see him last week to make an arrangement, to settle a final sum that would buy his permanent silence. He refused. He said he was going to tell everything, that he had decided he had nothing left to lose. And so you killed him, Holmes said. I had him killed, Carver said, with the precision of a man who has been careful about language for 60 years. I did not do it myself. He reached into the pocket of his robe. Holmes moved, but Carver's hand came out holding not a weapon, but an envelope. This is a full account of what I have done, he said, and the name of the man who killed Margrave. He is called Hollowell, and he has been in my employ for 20 years, and you will find him in Vauxhall. He set the envelope on the arm of his chair. I am dying, Mr. Holmes. I have 3 months, possibly 4. I am prepared to answer for what I did. I have been prepared for some time. He looked at the fire. Theodore Margrave was a good doctor, a better man than he believed himself to be. He didn't deserve what I did to him. Holmes took the envelope. "And Edgar Dunmore," he said. Carver shook his head. "His death was natural. I never hurt him. I only took advantage of the fact that he was dead." He paused. "Edgar Dunmore was my friend, my oldest friend, and I stole from him, and I used his death to cover the theft, and I spent 60 years living with both facts." He looked at the window. "Send for Lestrade," he said. "I'll wait." Hollowell was arrested in Vauxhall that evening, precisely where Carver's letter indicated he would be. The evidence in the letter was specific and detailed, the documentation of a man who had been meticulous about his own crimes for a lifetime. The prussic acid had been administered in the tea. Hollowell had entered through the mews while the housekeeper was occupied, added the acid to the cup Margrave had already been brought, and departed the same way. The note had been taken from Margrave's private journal, where he had written those exact words months earlier, and photographically reproduced with enough skill to pass a housekeeper's identification. It was, as Holmes said to me later, a crime of extraordinary patience and very ordinary motive. Carver spent 60 years afraid, Holmes said, and fear, when it is that old, is almost indistinguishable from habit. He did not kill Margrave because he was afraid any more. He killed him because the habit of protecting himself was so deeply embedded that he could not stop doing it, even when the urgency was gone. "He's dying in 3 months," I said. "Yes," which Margrave also knew, which was why Margrave finally decided to speak. He realized that Carver's death would not automatically protect him, that Carver's affairs would be examined, that the truth might emerge regardless. He wanted to be the one who told it. Holmes set down his pipe. He was too late, by 3 months. We were at Baker Street. It was late and the rain had finally stopped, the clouds moving east and a thin wash of cold stars appearing above the wet rooftops. "The note," I said. "I have tried to do right and failed." He wrote those words himself. He wrote them about himself, Holmes said. Not about the blackmail, about 1861, about what he had done and not done when he was 26 years old and frightened. He carried that for 60 years. He looked at the ceiling. "The weight of what we know," he said. "It is an extraordinary thing. We assume that secrets become lighter over time. They don't. They accumulate interest." The fire burned low. The clocks ticked. London breathed outside the window, still and wet and enormous. "Come," Holmes said, standing. "There's nothing more to do tonight, and you look as though you haven't slept in 3 days." "I haven't," I said. "Then sleep." He moved toward his room. "The case is resolved. Carver will be before the magistrate in the morning. Hollowell will be arraigned for murder. Mrs. Fairfax will finally have the answer that her father spent 20 years looking for." He paused at his door. "And Theodore Margrave, who was not a wicked man, but a frightened one who made a bad choice when he was young and paid for it for 36 years, will perhaps be remembered as someone who finally decided to tell the truth, even if the decision came too late." He went into his room. I sat by the dying fire and thought about the shape of the thing we had found today. Not a dramatic crime, not a theatrical conspiracy, but something quieter and heavier. A young physician in Leeds in 1861, finding something he shouldn't have found, making a compromise he shouldn't have made, and spending a lifetime living inside that compromise. A rich old man spending 60 years in the shadow of what he had taken and what he had used, dying now with the confession in his pocket because some part of him needed to say it before he went. The clocks counted the minutes. The city outside was very quiet. I closed my eyes. The inquest into the death of Theodore Margrave took place 6 days later. The verdict was murder by the hand of Ernest Hollowell, acting under the direction of Thomas Carver. Carver's confession was read into the record in full. Hollowell was sentenced to hang. Carver, who was genuinely dying, and who the court determined had cooperated so thoroughly that prosecution served little purpose, was remanded to his house under supervision. He died 4 months later, 2 weeks longer than his physician had predicted. Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax, the granddaughter of Edgar Dunmore, wrote a letter to Holmes expressing her relief at having the account of her grandfather's death finally complete, even if the account contained nothing more dramatic than the confirmation that a natural death had been exploited for profit. Her father had spent 20 years hunting for a murderer who didn't exist. The crime had been smaller than the grief it caused. Holmes read the letter twice and set it on the mantelpiece. The Dunmore family spent 30 years believing there was a murderer, he said, and there wasn't. The only crime was the theft and the cover-up. He looked at the letter. The story we tell ourselves about what happened is sometimes worse than what actually happened. The imagination fills the spaces with something more terrible. Margrave's silence helped, I said. Margrave's silence helped. Yes. He turned from the fireplace. He was protecting himself, of course, but his silence also protected Carver, and Carver's silence protected the Dunmore family from a truth they might have found it difficult to accept, that their grandfather simply died, and someone took advantage of it, and the drama they had built around that fact was their own construction. He sat in the armchair. The truth is usually quieter than we want it to be, he said. The lies we tell, and the lies we allow to persist, are often larger than the truth they conceal. I let that sit in the room for a moment. Outside, London had turned to a clear, cold December morning, the kind that comes after days of rain when the sky has finally been scoured clean and everything is sharp and exact and a little too bright. You could see across the rooftops. You could see the spire of one church and the dome of another, and the black edge of the park beyond, and it had the quality that clear days have of making things look closer than they are. When do you leave? Holmes said. I never know, I said. No, he agreed. You wouldn't. He picked up his violin from the sofa, where it had been sitting all morning, and turned it in his hands for a moment. Tell me, he said, when you go to the next place, is it always like this? Is it always people who have been carrying something for too long? Often, I said. He tucked the violin under his chin. That is the common condition, I suppose. The thing that was once the size of a choice becoming, over decades, the size of a life. He drew the bow across the strings, a single quiet note, testing. Most people carry their choices for much longer than the choices deserved. He began to play, not one of his formal pieces, something quieter, something he was finding as he went, the melody building bar by bar out of the morning, and the clear cold air and the quality of a case that had been resolved but not quite closed, because nothing involving 30 years of a man's life is ever quite closed. I sat in Watson's chair and listened, and the music did what music does in those rooms, at those moments. It gathered up everything that couldn't quite be said into something that didn't need saying, and held it there for a little while, and let it be what it was. The light came through the Baker Street windows, pale December gold. The fire was steady. The clocks counted. Harley Street has a quality in the morning that is unlike any other street in London. It begins before 8 o'clock, when the first carriages arrive. Private carriages mostly, the kind that suggest money without announcing it. Dark lacquered with brass fittings, drawn by horses that are groomed rather than merely serviceable. They pull up one by one to the white-columned entrances, and from them descend people who share a single distinguishing quality, the quality of not looking at each other. In Harley Street, you come to discuss the private things, your liver, your lungs, the thing you found last month that you haven't told anyone about yet. And so, the etiquette of the street is mutual blindness, a pretense that the person stepping out of the carriage 3 doors down is invisible to you, and you to them, because the alternative, acknowledging that you are both here, both carrying your particular burdens through the same door, is too human for a street this respectable. Holmes knew all of this. He knew it the way he knew most things about London's social machinery, not from having experienced it in the ordinary human way, but from the kind of concentrated observation that turns any institution, however private, into a readable text. We had come back to Harley Street the morning after Margrave's body was found, arriving before the official police presence had fully settled in, because Holmes understood that a scene is most readable in the first 12 hours and least readable after 3 days of official examination. The street was doing its ordinary morning business around us. A man in a top hat descended from a carriage at number 37, with the careful movements of someone in significant pain. A woman in grey wool came out of number 42, looking composed in the determined way that means you have arranged your face specifically because you don't want anyone to read it. The rain was still falling, though less heavily now. A fine drizzle that made the street cobbles shine and turned the halos of the gas lamps into something almost beautiful. Margrave's house was sealed with a constable at the door. Holmes presented himself, and the constable, recognizing him, stood aside. Inside, the house was in a condition of a place where a death has occurred and the official process has begun. Surfaces tested, objects moved slightly from their original positions, chalk marks on the floor of the consulting room where the body had been, the window at the rear examined and noted but not yet repaired. The house smelled of carbolic soap, and underneath it, the faint, persistent ghost of prussic acid, that distinctive bitter almond smell that no amount of cleaning entirely removes. Holmes went to the consulting room and stood in the doorway for a full minute without entering. I had learned to respect these moments of stillness. He was not standing still because he had nothing to do. He was standing still because he was completing a process, taking what the room looked like now and matching it against what it had looked like yesterday, registering the changes, the things that had moved, the things that hadn't, the things that were present that shouldn't have been, and the things that were absent that should have been there. Then he entered. He went to the window first. The rear window of Margrave's consulting room opened onto a small garden. Not a London garden of the grand type, but the practical narrow rectangle common to Harley Street properties, perhaps 20 feet deep, bounded by brick walls, with a path down the centre and borders on either side that had gone to winter dormancy. Beyond the rear wall, a gate opened to the mews that ran behind the terrace. The service access, where deliveries were made and where, Holmes had noted yesterday, anyone who knew the layout could move without being visible from the street. He examined the window latch again. Yesterday's observation stood. Fresh scratches on the brass, the bright metallic gleam of new damage in contrast to the duller patina of the surrounding surface. The latch could be manipulated from outside with the right tool, a thin blade, or a purpose-made instrument, if you knew exactly where to apply pressure, and someone had known exactly where to apply it. He came in from the garden, Holmes said, more to himself than to me. Through this window, in the afternoon, while the housekeeper was in the kitchen. The consulting room is at the rear of the house. The kitchen is at the basement level, also at the rear. If she was working at the kitchen range, she would have heard nothing above her own noise. He moved to the fireplace and crouched before the grate. The paper ash was still there. The police surgeon's examination had been conducted without disturbing it, and Lestrade's men had noted it, but left it in place pending Holmes's analysis. Holmes had brought small glass vials and a pair of fine tweezers, and he began now to extract the fragments of burnt paper with a patience that bordered on the meditative, laying each piece on a sheet of white card he had produced from his bag. Most of the fragments were too consumed to reveal anything, but 3 were legible, or partially legible. The paper had been letter quality, a good heavy stock. The handwriting on the surviving fragments was not Margrave's hand. It was different, a more angular script, masculine, with a quality of deliberateness that suggested someone writing for an audience even in private correspondence. Holmes examined the fragments with the lens. The word here, he said, indicating the largest piece, reads account, and here, obligation. And this fragment, the burning didn't reach this corner. You can read, as we agreed in the matter of. He set down the lens. These are not Margrave's documents. Someone else wrote these, and they were burned in this fireplace, recently, by someone who needed them destroyed. He paused. The person who came through the window. They destroyed their own correspondence, I said. They removed evidence, carefully and thoroughly, everything that might have connected them to Margrave. He stood, except for one thing they didn't know existed. He crossed to the bookcase along the near wall. Margrave's bookcase was the bookcase of a physician who read widely, medical texts and pharmaceutical references on the top shelves, then a run of anatomy volumes, then natural history, then what appeared to be general literature, Dickens, Thackeray, a set of Trollope in matching bindings, several volumes of sermons that suggested a sincere but private faith. On the lowest shelf, a row of cloth-bound volumes that were not books at all, but journals, personal journals, their spines dated by year, going back 2 decades. Holmes crouched and read the spines. He pulled one from the shelf, not the most recent, but one from 3 years ago, and opened it. His handwriting, he said, consistent with the note. He turned pages, reading quickly. He wrote regularly, 2 or 3 times a week. Medical observations, personal reflections. He was a thoughtful man. He paused at a page. Listen to this, from March of last year. The payments continue. I am beginning to understand that they will never end, that this is the shape my life will take until one of us dies. I have made my peace with this in the sense that one makes peace with a condition one cannot cure, by learning to manage it rather than hoping for recovery. But I am not at peace. I am merely in a state of managed suffering. He closed the journal and replaced it exactly. He wrote about the blackmail, I said, obliquely, in language that is emotionally revealing but operationally vague. No names, no amounts, nothing that would be immediately legible to someone who found the journal without context. Holmes stood. But someone who found the journal and read it carefully and who already knew the context would be able to understand it, and they would be able to find in these pages passages that served their purposes. The note. I believe the note, the suicide note, was transcribed from these journals, not copied exactly, but assembled. The voice is authentic because it draws on authentic material. He looked at the row of journals. The man who came through this window read these journals. He found the passage that became the note, and he was able to reproduce it, either by hand or by some photographic method, in a way convincing enough to pass a brief inspection. He gathered his things. The ash in the grate is his own correspondence. What he wanted removed, Holmes said. The journals are Margrave's, and he didn't know about them. A small mistake, but small mistakes are the ones that matter. Holmes spent 2 hours that evening with Margrave's appointment book, and what he produced from those 2 hours was a picture of the last 3 months of a man's professional life that was at once ordinary and, in its patterns, deeply strange. The appointment book was a large ledger, cloth-bound, with each day's page divided into half-hour slots from 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. The entries were in Margrave's hand, each one giving the patient's name and, in most cases, a brief notation about the nature of the consultation. It was the record of a busy and respected practice. The names that appeared were the names of comfortable middle-class and upper-middle-class London life, with several from the aristocracy, and the notations spoke of the ordinary range of ailments that people bring to a doctor of Margrave's standing: cardiac concerns, respiratory complaints, the management of chronic conditions, the reassurance that this particular symptom does not indicate what the patient fears it does. What Holmes found was this. For 3 months, from early September to the day of Margrave's death, there was a patient recorded every 15 days whose entry was anomalous in 2 ways. The name given was Price. No first name, no address, no notation about the consultation. Just the name, alone in the time slot. Every other entry in the book gave at least a street address. Most gave a full address with house number. The Price entries gave nothing. 15 days is a regular interval, Holmes said, the appointment book open on the table. Not a medical interval. There's no therapeutic reason to see a physician at exactly 15-day intervals, but it's a convenient interval for a regular payment arrangement, close enough for the payer to remain in control, not so frequent as to create conspicuous regularity. He was paying the blackmailer here, I said. In the consulting room. In the consulting room, Holmes said, disguised as a medical appointment, which means anyone observing the schedule would see nothing remarkable. A physician seeing a patient. He turned pages forward and back, checking. The first Price entry is September the 9th. If Carver's account is correct, that something changed 3 months ago. Then September is when whatever changed became actionable. What changed 3 months ago? Holmes set down the book. Carver told me he is dying. His physician gave him 3 months or 4 months, which means the diagnosis was given approximately in September. He looked at the fire. When Carver learned he was dying, he moved to resolve his outstanding arrangement with Margrave. He arranged the payments, the appointments, to make a final settlement, but Margrave refused, because he decided to speak, because Carver's impending death changed Margrave's calculation. While Carver lived, silence bought Margrave protection. Carver had an interest in keeping him quiet, not in exposing him. Once Carver died, that protection disappeared. The arrangement would end, yes, but Margrave might still face exposure if Carver's papers were examined after his death. And Margrave had lived for 30 years with what he knew. the thing he described as trying to do right and failing. A man of 62, with perhaps 20 years remaining to him, might decide that the only real protection was finally to speak. Not because it was entirely safe, it wasn't, but because silence had become its own kind of unbearable. Holmes stood and went to the window. Baker Street below was dark and wet, a cab moving slowly through the puddles, its lantern reflecting in the surface of the road. "There is something in this case that is worth attending to," he said. "Not the crime itself. The crime is straightforward once you know the shape of it, but the thing underneath the crime." He turned from the window. Margrave was not an evil man. He was a young man who encountered a situation he was not equipped to handle, made a bad decision under pressure, and spent 36 years living inside that decision. He didn't benefit greatly from it. The payments he received were enough to keep him quiet, not enough to make him rich, and the cost in terms of what he carried was enormous. He looked at the appointment book. People commit themselves to courses of action when they are young and frightened, and then they spend the rest of their lives maintaining those commitments, even when the fear has faded, because the commitment has become part of who they are. "Can they ever get out?" I asked. Margrave was trying, Holmes said. He was trying to get out, at 62. The only reason he failed was that he waited too long, and the person he had been enabling decided to act first. He paused, but the attempt itself matters. He decided at the end to tell the truth. The decision was too late to save him, but it was not nothing. He picked up the appointment book again. "Mr. Price had an appointment scheduled for December the 2nd, he said. 4 days from now. If Margrave had lived, he would have told Carver's representative, or Carver himself, at that meeting that the arrangement was over, that he intended to speak." He set the book down. "Instead, they moved first." He was quiet for a moment. "The man who enters from the rear," he said, almost to himself. "The man who is careful. The man who burns his correspondence and leaves a false note and exits through a garden while a housekeeper cooks downstairs. Hollowell. I need to know about Hollowell. Hollowell was found in Vauxhall, as Carver's letter specified. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that is unremarkable because every feature has been carefully kept unremarkable. Not ugly, not handsome, not notable. He was the kind of man who could stand on a street corner for 20 minutes and be forgotten by everyone who passed. Holmes recognized this quality immediately. "You have spent considerable effort," Holmes said, sitting across from him in the police room where Lestrade had arranged the interview. "On being forgettable." Hollowell said nothing. "The rear entrance to Margrave's consulting room," Holmes said. "The mews behind Harley Street. You knew the building well." Hollowell looked at the table between them. "Carver's letter accounts for the crime in detail," Holmes said. "What I want to understand is the method. Not for the law's benefit. Lestrade has what he needs, for my own." A pause. Then, "What does it matter?" "It matters because I want to understand how a man of your experience looked at what he was being asked to do and decided to do it," Holmes said. "Margrave was not a criminal. He was a physician who had made a bad choice and lived with it honestly for 36 years. Hollowell looked up. It was a brief look, quickly returned to the table, but it registered. "The acid," he said, after a moment. "I put it in the tea. The tea that was already in the room. The housekeeper had left it. I came in through the window while she was in the kitchen. I had perhaps 10 minutes. He was quiet. It's very quick. He didn't suffer much." "That consideration was important to you," Holmes said. Another brief look. He was an old man. Hollowell said it flatly, as if that closed the subject. The note, Holmes said. How was it produced? Mr. Carver had found it in the journals. He photographed the page. He has a camera. Very clear reproduction. I practiced the handwriting for a week. He looked at his own hands. It isn't forgery exactly. It's copying. It looks right because the words are right. The actual words from the actual page. And you knew the journals were there. Mr. Carver had been there before. He knew the house well. Holmes looked at him. You've been with Carver for 20 years. Since I was 21. What did he tell you? Holmes said quietly. About why this needed to be done. Hollowell was a long time answering. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, a clock was ticking. He said Margrave was going to the police, Hollowell said. That everything Mr. Carver had built was going to be destroyed. He paused. I didn't know exactly what Margrave was going to say. I knew it was something from a long time ago. Mr. Carver didn't tell me the details. But you did it anyway. He asked me to. Hollowell said it simply, not apologetically, not defiantly, as if it were a sufficient reason, which in the world he had inhabited for 20 years, it was. Holmes sat with that for a moment. One more thing, he said. The documents you burned in the grate, Carver's letters to Margrave. I took everything I could find, everything with Mr. Carver's name. He paused. I didn't know about the journals. No, Holmes said. That was the mistake. He stood. For what it's worth, Hollowell said, as Holmes moved to the door. Holmes stopped. Mr. Carver is dying, Hollowell said. He's had the diagnosis for 3 months. He asked me to do this because he wanted to die without it, without the threat of it. He looked at the table. I understand why he wanted that. I don't think I was wrong to do what I did for him, but I understand why you think I was. Holmes looked at him for a moment. What you did for him, he said, was ensure that instead of dying with an old guilt, he is dying with a new one. And so are you. He opened the door. That is the arithmetic of these things. He left. The fire at Baker Street was particularly good that evening. Mrs. Hudson had laid it well, coal and wood, built up in the way that produces both heat and light, so that the sitting room glowed and the familiar disorder of the place softened into something almost comfortable. Holmes sat with his violin across his knees. He wasn't playing it. He was holding it, in the way he sometimes held it when he was processing the end of a case, as if the instrument were a kind of ballast. Tell me something, I said. The Dunmore case. If there was no murder, if Edgar Dunmore genuinely died of cardiac failure, then what Margrave was covering up was something much smaller than his family believed. Substantially smaller, Holmes said. The theft of business funds by Carver, exploiting the disruption of Dunmore's sudden death. A serious crime, but not a murder. The Dunmore family spent decades grieving a murder that never happened. Does Mrs. Fairfax know that yet? Lestrade will tell her tomorrow, I expect. He looked at the fire. It will be complicated news. She has built her understanding of her grandfather's death around the assumption of murder. The truth, that the death was natural and the crime was financial, removes the drama. It may be harder to accept than an outright murder would have been. The smaller truth after the larger story, I said. Yes, which is its own kind of grief. He was quiet for a moment. People invest in narratives. When those narratives turn out to be inaccurate, what is lost is not just the full story. It's the 30 years of emotion attached to it. Gerald Dunmore's crusade, his certainty, his sense of mission, all of it built on a foundation that was not what it appeared. He turned the violin over in his hands. "And Margrave," he said. He knew this. He knew the death was natural. He knew what Carver had done was the theft, not the murder. And he covered it up. Initially because he was paid to, and later because the covering up had become part of his identity. He set the violin back on the sofa. But his journal entries, the ones that became the note, they speak of having failed to do right, which is accurate. He failed to report Carver's theft. He failed the Dunmore family by allowing the false version to stand. He paused. He didn't fail them by covering up a murder, because there was no murder. But the silence about the theft was itself a failure, and he carried it. I thought about the shape of that. A man who had made a bad choice at 26 and carried it for 36 years, the weight of it growing not because the original crime was so terrible, but because the silence about it had accumulated its own moral weight over time. Every year of not speaking, every year of taking the payment and staying quiet and telling himself it was over when it was never over. What would have happened, I asked, if he had spoken at the start, in 1861? He would have been young and frightened and in a vulnerable position, Holmes said. Carver would have fought it. Carver had more resources, more connections, more experience of using power. Margrave might have come off badly. He paused. But he would have come off badly once, instead of carrying it for 36 years and dying because of it. The cost of the short-term difficulty versus the long-term cost, I said. Almost always, Holmes said, the thing people are afraid to do in the moment almost always costs less than what they pay to avoid doing it. He picked up his pipe. This is the lesson of half the cases I investigate. Not that crimes are committed, that is simply true, but that the crimes that have the most lasting consequences are the ones built on a foundation of avoiding something difficult. Carver avoided confronting his own thieving. Margrave avoided confronting Carver. Both of them built their lives around that avoidance, and both of them ended in the same room with Lestrade asking questions. He lit the pipe. There is a kind of courage, he said, that most people do not think of as courage because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't involve facing a gun or a fire. It involves saying a difficult thing to someone who doesn't want to hear it, at a moment when you would very much rather not say it. Margrave lacked that courage in 1861, and it defined the next 36 years of his life. He drew on the pipe. In December of this year, he found it. Too late, but he found it. The fire crackled. The clocks ticked. You admired him, I said, despite everything. Holmes thought about this for a moment. I respected what he was trying to do at the end, he said carefully. Which is not quite the same as admiring him. He was not a good man in the complete sense. He was a man who made a significant moral failure and lived with it and attempted, finally, to correct it. He paused. That is something. It is not everything. But it is something. He smoked in silence for a while. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night was cold and clear. The clouds that had covered London for 3 days finally moved on, and in their absence the sky above the city was surprisingly dark, the stars dimmed by the gas lamp haze but present, a faint dusting of them above the wet rooftops. You're going, Holmes said. It was not a question. Soon, I said. The next case will be different, he said. They're always different. He looked at the ceiling. The most instructive thing about taking one case after another is that the variety is truly extraordinary. I have in my files documented accounts of crimes committed for reasons of jealousy, greed, fear, injured pride, genuine malice, misguided loyalty, catastrophically poor judgment, and in 3 cases a form of moral reasoning so convoluted as to be indistinguishable from its opposite. And yet underneath all of them, the same few things. The desire to protect oneself. The desire to obtain what one believes one deserves. The desire to prevent others from knowing what one has done. He looked at me. Human motivation turns out, on close examination, to be considerably less complex than human beings prefer to believe. That's a bleak assessment, I said. It is an accurate one, he said pleasantly. I do not find it bleak. I find it clarifying. When you understand the mechanism, you can read the output. He settled back in the armchair. The mechanism is simple. The output is infinitely varied. That variety is what makes this work interesting. He closed his eyes. Wake me if Lestrade telegrams, he said. He was asleep in under 2 minutes. Hollowell's confession and the arrest were administrative matters from this point. Holmes's part was done. He slept in the armchair with the ease of someone who has complete confidence in his own resources and therefore no anxiety about whether they will be required. I sat in Watson's chair and watched the fire and thought about Theodore Margrave and Thomas Carver, and a mill owner named Edgar Dunmore who had simply died in 1861 and whose death had been transformed into something larger than it was by the actions of the people around it. And I thought about the long chain of consequences that flows from a single moment of moral failure, not the dramatic failure, not the crime itself, but the smaller choice that comes before it. The choice not to speak, not to act, not to say the difficult thing at the moment it needed to be said. Margrave choosing silence in 1861. 36 years of managed suffering following from that choice, a murder at the end of it, not because the original wrong was so terrible, but because the silence about it had grown into something that could not be maintained. The clocks on the Baker Street mantelpiece measured the distance from that thought to the next in their patient, reliable way. The following morning Lestrade came with the paperwork of the arrest, and Holmes signed what needed to be signed and answered what needed to be answered, and by 11 o'clock the official machinery had done what official machinery does, which is to take the essential facts of a case and repackage them in the language of procedure and testimony. Hollowell was formally charged with murder. Carver, too frail to be detained at Scotland Yard, was placed under house arrest in Chelsea with a constable at the door, pending the coroner's determination about whether he could stand trial. His solicitor had already arrived. The negotiation between what Carver had confessed and what could actually be proved was underway. He confessed completely, Lestrade said, accepting tea from Mrs. Hudson with the grateful air of a man who has not slept. Voluntarily. In writing. Witnessed. Yes, Holmes said. In my experience, Lestrade began. In your experience, guilty men do not typically confess voluntarily, Holmes said. And you're right. Carver is not a typical case. He is an old man who is dying, who has been carrying this for 60 years, and who reached a point where the confession was necessary. Not from remorse exactly, from the particular need that very old people sometimes have to ensure that their account of their own life is complete before they leave it. He set down his cup. He wanted the story finished correctly. The suicide note was his attempt to finish it on his terms. Now it will be finished on other terms, but it will be finished. Lestrade shook his head slowly. 60 years, he said. Think of what you could do with 60 years. What Carver did with it, Holmes said, was live it as best he could under the terms he had created for himself, which is what most people do. He looked at the window. The constraints we impose on ourselves become the shape of our lives. We rarely notice how much we have limited ourselves by the early choices we made, because the constraints have been in place so long that they feel like the natural shape of things rather than a cage we built and then forgot we were in. Lestrade looked at him with the expression he often wore in Holmes's presence, the expression of someone who had expected information and received philosophy instead, and was not entirely sure how to process the difference. "Right," he said. "I'll take that as a comment on the case." "Take it however you like," Holmes said pleasantly. "The important thing is that Hollowell is arrested and Carver is charged. Mrs. Fairfax will need someone to speak to her. I'd recommend doing it sooner rather than later. She's been living with a version of her grandfather's story that is about to be significantly revised." "I'll go this afternoon," Lestrade said. He finished his tea and stood. "You know, Holmes, most of these cases, the ones I bring to you, or the ones that find their own way here, they're straightforward once you take the view from above. It's only when you're in the middle of them that they seem complicated." "That is exactly right," Holmes said. "And it is the reason why my position, looking from above, looking at the whole, is useful. Everyone in a situation is in the middle of it. No one who is in the middle of it can see the whole." He picked up his violin. "That is not a criticism of the people involved. It is simply the geometry of the thing." Lestrade put on his hat. "I'll be in touch," he said. "You always are," Holmes said, and began to play before the door had fully closed. 3 days after Hollowell's arrest, Holmes received a letter from Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax. He read it at the breakfast table twice, and then set it on the mantelpiece beside the others. "She thanks me," he said, "and she says she does not know whether the truth is easier to carry than the story she grew up with. She says it is different, a different kind of weight." He picked up his coffee. "She also says that her father's certainty about the murder, his conviction that Dunmore was poisoned, was the defining purpose of the last 20 years of his father's life. And she wonders whether that purpose, even if built on a false foundation, gave him something to live for. Whether the story, even an inaccurate story, was useful in a way that the truth cannot replicate." "What do you think?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think she is right, that the useful story and the true story are often different things," he said. "And I think she is also right to suspect that value." He set down the coffee. "The purpose that is built on a false foundation fails at the moment the foundation is exposed. Gerald Dunmore spent 20 years hunting a murderer who didn't exist. When the truth came out, that purpose, all that energy, all that passion, was revealed to have been pointed at nothing. The grief was real. The purpose was not." He looked at the letter. "A purpose built on the truth is slower to assemble and harder to maintain, but it does not collapse when the light hits it." I thought about that. "The case," I said. "At its heart, what was it really about?" Holmes considered the question seriously, which he always did when I asked something that way. "It was about the cost of silence," he said. "The compounding cost. Margrave's silence in 1861 cost him 36 years and his life. Carver's silence cost him 60 years and his legacy. The Dunmore family's silence, the acceptance of the official version, cost Gerald Dunmore 20 years of a crusade and his daughter a life spent carrying a story she didn't know was wrong." He paused. Every actor in this drama chose, at some critical moment, not to say the thing that needed to be said, and each of those choices built on the others, until the accumulated weight of all that unsaid material produced a murder. "And if someone had spoken," I said. "If Margrave had reported Carver's theft in 1861, Carver would have faced consequences then. Small consequences, a financial crime, not a violent one. Margrave would have faced questions about his own role in the cover-up. which was brief and not yet deep. The Dunmore family would have known the truth, that the death was natural and the crime was financial. He spread his hands. It would have been difficult. It would not have been this. The clocks on the mantelpiece ticked their way through the morning. There is a lesson in that, I said. There are several, Holmes said. I am not in the business of lessons. I am in the business of facts. But if the facts suggest anything, it is this. The moment at which it is most difficult to say the true thing is almost always the moment at which it is most important. He looked at the fire. Difficulty is the signal, not a reason to delay. He picked up the violin from the sofa. I'm going to practice, he said. Watson will be back from Portsmouth tomorrow, and I suspect he will have opinions about how I have managed the flat in his absence, and I would like to have achieved something worthwhile in the past 3 days that I can point to. He tucked the violin under his chin, other than solving the murder which he takes for granted. He began to play. It was a Mendelssohn piece, the kind that sounds effortless and is not, the kind that requires absolute control of the instrument to make it sound as natural as breathing. He played it from memory, standing by the window with the December light coming in flat and cold, and it filled the sitting room the way good music fills a room, by making the room the shape of the sound, rather than just the space that contains it. I sat with it for a while. Then I felt the pull, a quality of presence and absence that signals the approach of transition. The world doing what it does. The sitting room becoming slightly less solid, slightly more like a memory of itself. Holmes was playing, eyes closed. Thank you, I said, which may or may not have been heard. The violin continued, and then I was somewhere else. I want to tell you about the sitting room at Baker Street one more time. Not because it changes. It doesn't change. It persists with a kind of cheerful stubbornness through whatever cases arrive and depart. But because there is something in the constancy of it that I find, every time I leave it, worth preserving. The correspondence pinned to the mantelpiece with the jackknife, the chemical apparatus on the sideboard, the vials and retorts and burners of a private laboratory conducted in a domestic space, which is itself a kind of statement about what Holmes believes science is for. The violin case open on the sofa, the skull serving as a paperweight for the letters he hasn't answered, the Persian slipper on the mantelpiece in which he keeps his tobacco, and the fire, always the fire, the Baker Street fire, which Mrs. Hudson tends with the same reliable care she tends everything, which is the warm centre around which the rest of the room is organised. In that room, the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary register. A woman comes in from the rain with a story. A telegram arrives with 3 words. A street urchin appears at the door with information he doesn't know is information. And Holmes, from the armchair, from the chemical bench, from the window where he stands, looking at the street below, with those extraordinary eyes, reads all of it and assembles it, and eventually says, "Here is what happened. Here is what happened." That is what the cases are, at their heart. The explanation of what happened, not what appeared to happen, not what the frightened or guilty or grieving parties needed to have happened, but the actual sequence of events that produced this moment in this room with this evidence. And once you know what happened, the weight of it changes. Not always. The truth is not always lighter than the lie it replaces, but it is different. It is the weight of the real rather than the weight of the imagined. And between those two kinds of weight, there is an important distinction. Dr. Margrave spent 36 years carrying the imagined weight of what might happen if he spoke. The imagined consequence, ruin, exposure, the loss of everything he had built, grew heavier with every year because imagination is not bounded the way reality is. Reality is what it is. Imagination, left to itself, expands to fill whatever space is available and then keeps going. The actual consequence of speaking in 1861 would have been difficult and finite and survivable. The imagined consequence grew until it was the size of his life. What he carried, in the end, was mostly imagination. Let me tell you something about sleep. Sleep is not the absence of thought. It is the reorganization of thought. The night mind doing the work of sorting what was taken in during the day, deciding what matters and what doesn't, filing the important things and releasing the rest. During the hours of sleep, the accumulated weight of the day is processed and distributed, and some of it, much of it, if you're lucky, is simply dissolved. What you're carrying right now, in this moment, in the dark wherever you are, some of it is real, some of it is not. The real things will be there in the morning, unchanged. The not real things, the imagined consequences, the constructed fears, the elaborate architecture of what might happen, those can be released. The night is very good at releasing them, if you let it. The fire at Baker Street burns low. The violin has gone quiet. The clocks count. London breathes outside the window, enormous and particular and entirely indifferent to any individual's worry, carrying on its immense business of being a city. 4 million lives going about their 4 million private versions of the same basic project. You are not 4 million people. You are one, which is enough. One person, in one place, breathing in the dark, letting the day go and the night come. Let the night do what night does. Let it take the weight. Let the clocks count you toward morning in their patient, reliable way. You have been in Harley Street in the rain. You have been in a library reading room with old newspapers and the smell of time. You have been in a drawing room in Chelsea with a dying man who needed to confess. You can leave all of those rooms now. The cases are closed. The truth is what it is, and you are here in the dark, and the night holds you, and the clocks are counting. Holmes spent the morning after the discovery of the body with his files. This was, I had come to understand, a phase of every investigation that was as essential as any other and considerably less dramatic than most. The files occupied 2 full shelves of the Baker Street bookcase, not the books themselves, which were arranged with some concession to order, but the documents behind and between them. The folders and envelopes and bound notebooks and loose papers that constituted Holmes's indexed knowledge of the criminal and near-criminal world of London, and, increasingly, the wider world beyond London. They were organized by a system that was entirely legible to Holmes and entirely opaque to anyone else. But they were organized, and he could find what he needed with an efficiency that would have struck a professional archivist as either inspiring or insulting. Margrave appears 4 times in my files, he said, without looking up from the folder he was working through. The first 2 appearances relate to consultations I've described. The third is a mention in a case from 1889. I was investigating the disappearance of a patient from a Knightsbridge clinic, and Margrave was consulted as an expert on certain pharmaceutical matters. The fourth, he paused. The fourth is interesting. He extracted a sheet of paper from the folder. It was a copy of a newspaper cutting, written in Holmes's hand rather than the original. The practice he used for items he could not clip. Yorkshire Post, 1862, he said. A brief article. The headline reads, Dunmore Inquest, Verdict Delivered. The text is what I'd expect. The standard reporting of the coroner's court returning a natural causes verdict. But look at the final paragraph. passed the paper across. The final paragraph of the article read, "It is understood that the young physician whose certificate gave rise to the proceedings is understood to have recently departed the West Riding, his whereabouts being at present unknown. Dr. Margrave, who provided evidence to the coroner's court maintaining that his original assessment of natural causes was correct and appropriate, has not been seen in Leeds since the conclusion of the inquest." "He left immediately after the inquest," I said, "within days apparently, and arrived in London shortly after. I have his registration at the Wimpole Street address from early 1863. He moved quickly. He was frightened." Holmes retrieved the paper. "What frightened him was not the inquest. He survived the inquest. His certificate was upheld. What frightened him was what Carver knew. The inquest concluded, the certificate was upheld, and then Carver, who had sat through the whole proceedings and watched Margrave maintain his position, came to him and told him what the new arrangement would be. The payment, or perhaps something else first, some expression of what Carver held over him, something from his Edinburgh years perhaps. Whatever it was enough to send Margrave south immediately without taking the time to make a proper departure." Holmes folded the paper carefully. "The haste matters. A man who is simply relieved that an inquest has gone his way does not flee the county immediately afterward. Margrave left because the inquest conclusion was also a trap closing." He returned to the files. "The Edinburgh connection," I said. "You mentioned earlier that you thought Carver had information from Margrave's time before Leeds. What would that have been?" "Medical training in the late 1850s was not what it became," Holmes said. "The standards were being established during that period. The Medical Act of 1858 was the first comprehensive legislation requiring formal qualification, and in the years immediately preceding and following it, the lines between competent practice and incompetent practice were still being drawn. A young physician in Edinburgh in the mid-1850s might have encountered situations, or created them, that would not have been permissible under later standards." He closed one folder and opened another. "I am speculating. I do not know specifically what Carver held over him, but the pattern is consistent with someone who had access to medical information that was damaging, and that Margrave had reason to believe would survive scrutiny if examined." Carver had connections in Edinburgh, or in Leeds, or in the networks of the legal and commercial world that connect those two cities. Holmes set down the second folder. "The important thing is not the nature of the leverage. We may never know it exactly. The important thing is that it existed and that Margrave believed it was real." He stood and went to the window. "There is one more person I want to speak to," he said, looking down at the morning street. "Before we go to the library and before we go to Chelsea, there is a name in Margrave's appointment book. His 2 o'clock on the day he died. Carver, Mr. Carver. But I want to speak to someone who knew them both. You said Gerald Dunmore is dead. His partner in the practice of soliciting the original case is not." He turned from the window. "The solicitor who handled the Dunmore family's case in 1861. The man Gerald Dunmore employed to press for the inquest. He was a junior partner at the time. He is now 74 and retired, but he is still alive. He was already reaching for his coat. His name is Bartholomew Hoe, and he lives in Islington. Bartholomew Hoe received us in a study that was the study of a man who had spent 50 years in a profession that generates paper and had never quite managed to rid himself of it. The shelves were overfull. The desk was stacked with folders that had acquired the patina of things not looked at for years, but not quite disposable either. On the walls, framed certificates, alongside watercolor landscapes of the kind that a certain generation acquired from their children, and then kept out of loyalty rather than preference. He was a small, wiry man, with very white hair and very sharp eyes, still possessed of a quality that long practice in the law produces, the ability to listen to a question and consider it before answering, rather than simply saying the first thing that presented itself. He had been expecting us, or something like us, for some time. The look on his face when Holmes presented the case was not surprise, but a form of recognition. The look of a man seeing something he had long imagined finally arrive. "I always thought there was more to the Dunmore matter than came out at the inquest," he said, when Holmes had given him the essential shape of what had happened. Gerald Dunmore never let it rest. I told him, repeatedly, that the inquest had been properly conducted and the verdict was proper. But he was certain. He spent 20 years certain. "Was he wrong?" Holmes said. Ho was quiet for a moment. "About whether his grandfather was murdered? Yes, I now believe he was wrong. Edgar Dunmore died of his heart. Carver's theft was real, but the death was natural." He looked at his hands. "But about there being something wrong, about there being something that had not come to light. He was right. He just couldn't find the thing. Because Margrave maintained the certificate. Because Margrave was impeccable." Herb pressed his lips together. "I interviewed him 3 times, twice at Gerald's request and once at the formal inquiry stage. He was precise, consistent, professionally unimpeachable. He had the demeanor of a man who was telling the truth, which he was, in the literal sense. The death certificate said cardiac failure, and the death was cardiac failure. The lie was in the omission." He shook his head slowly. What he omitted to mention was that he had been present at certain business meetings in the weeks before Dunmore's death, that he had seen records he should not have seen, that he had been approached by Carver and induced to silence. None of that appeared in his evidence. "Did you suspect it at the time?" Holmes said. Herr was a long time answering. "I suspected there was something. Not specifically what. Margrave was too composed, if you understand me. A young man of 26, in front of a coroner's court, being questioned about the death of a patient he had signed off on. The ordinary human response involves some anxiety, some discomfort, some of the normal turbulence that comes with being scrutinized. Margrave had none of that. He was perfectly composed." He paused. "At the time, I attributed it to professional training. In retrospect, I think it was the composure of someone who had made a decision and was not going to deviate from it." "The decision bought with a payment," Holmes said, "or the threat of exposure, or both." Herr looked at the window. "I have thought about this case many times over 50 years. It was the case that troubled me most in my career, not because it was the largest or the most dramatic, but because I was certain that something was there and I couldn't find it. And Gerald Dunmore was certain too. And eventually Gerald died, and his daughter carries it. And all this time..." He stopped. "It was a theft, a financial crime. That's all." "That's all," Holmes confirmed quietly. Herr was quiet for a moment. "It feels smaller than the story we built around it," he said. "It is smaller," Holmes said. "The story grew in the absence of the truth, in the space left by what Margrave didn't say. The Dunmore family constructed a narrative that was larger and more dramatic than the reality. That is a very human thing to do." He paused. "It is also one of the reasons silence is so dangerous. The gaps it creates are filled by something." Herr nodded slowly. "Margrave," he said. "He maintained his silence for 36 years. For 36 years. And then he tried to speak and was killed for it." Another long quiet. Did he have family? Her asked. A sister in Gloucester, I believe, and a niece. Holmes stood. Thank you, Mr. Ho. You've been helpful. Have I? The old solicitor looked at him. I've only confirmed what you already knew. Confirmation, Holmes said, is rarely nothing. On Friday morning, 2 days after the arrest, a letter arrived at Baker Street. It was addressed in a hand I didn't recognize, an old man's hand, somewhat unsteady but precise. And when Holmes opened it, he stood for a moment reading it before sitting down. Carver, he said. He read it aloud. Mr. Holmes, I am told you are the person responsible for the recent proceedings which have led to the arrest of my employee and my own situation. I have no complaint about this. The proceedings were just, and the facts are as recorded. I write only to add one thing to the record which I believe is incomplete as it stands. Theodore Margrave and I are both guilty men, but the nature of our guilt is different in a way that I think matters, and which has not been stated clearly in any of the official accounts. Margrave's guilt was this. At 26, frightened, under pressure, he chose silence over honesty. He then spent 36 years living inside that choice, paying for it daily in the currency of his own integrity, becoming, by his own account, less and less the man he wished to be. My guilt is different. I was not frightened. I was not under pressure. I made a deliberate choice to take what I could take and to use what power I had to protect the taking. There was nothing done to me that compelled me to act as I did. I acted freely, out of greed and self-interest, and I spent 60 years protecting that act, not because I was unable to stop, but because I had decided that my comfort was more important than any other consideration. I am stating this because I want it on record that Margrave's guilt and mine are not equivalent. He was weak, I was wicked. Both things produced a murder, but they are not the same thing. Yours faithfully, Thomas Carver. Holmes set the letter on the mantelpiece beside the others. He was quiet for a while. He's right, I said. He is precisely right, Holmes said. The distinction between weakness and wickedness is real and it matters. Both can lead to the same consequences. But the character they reflect is different, and the accountability is different, and the nature of whatever redemption is possible is different. He looked at the letter. Carver understands himself clearly. That is unusual. Most people who have done what Carver has done construct a version of their actions that is easier to look at. He hasn't. He's looked at it directly and described it accurately. Does that change anything? It changes nothing about the legal situation, Holmes said. It changes something about how we understand the case. He turned from the mantelpiece. Cases are not simply crimes plus investigations plus arrests. They are human situations that happen to have a criminal component. The criminal component is what I am engaged to address. But the human situation is always larger. He went to the window. Carver is dying, he said. He will die having written that letter. Hollowell is in custody. Margrave is dead. The Dunmore family has their answer, or the closest version of the answer that is available. He looked at the street. Mrs. Fairfax has a different grief now than she had a week ago, smaller in some ways and larger in others. Smaller because the crime was a theft and not a murder. Larger because the theft and the silence about it and everything that followed produced a murder in the end. He turned. Nothing in this case was inevitable, he said. Every step of it required a choice. Carver's choice in 1861. Margrave's choice. Gerald Dunmore's choice to invest his life in the investigation. Each one of those choices closed off some paths and opened others, and the accumulated weight of them produced Thursday morning in a consulting room in Harley Street. He picked up his violin. it is worth attending to. The way choices accumulate, the way a single moment of weakness or wickedness sends ripples outward across decades. He drew the bow across the strings once, experimentally. But that, he said, is philosophy. And philosophy, unlike a case, has no resolution. He settled the violin under his chin. Give it to sleep. Let the night think about it. I want to try to explain something about what it is to watch Holmes at work. Not on the dramatic moments, the moments of deduction and confrontation, but on the quieter moments that surround them. The hours in the files, the time spent at the window looking at the street below, the evenings with the violin when the work is done and the mind is still turning something over. Holmes is often described, in the accounts Watson writes, as a thinking machine, as something cold and mechanical and devoid of feeling. This is not accurate. What he is someone who has developed, over years of practice, the ability to separate his feelings from his thinking in the way that a surgeon separates surgical shock from the technical work of the procedure. The feelings are present. They are simply not interfering with the work. What Holmes felt about Theodore Margrave, I think, was something in the vicinity of sorrow. Not sentimentality. He was not sentimental. But a clear-eyed recognition of what a human life looks like when it has been structured around a single bad decision made in youth. The decades of managed suffering that Margrave described in his journal. The careful professional life built on top of a crack in its own foundation. The end that came from the direction of the choice, not despite it. And what he felt about Thomas Carver was something harder to name. Not admiration, not sympathy, but perhaps the particular respect that one analytical intelligence pays to another that has operated efficiently and consistently. Carver had done a terrible thing and had protected it for 60 years with unusual effectiveness. That effectiveness was not a virtue, but it was a fact, and Holmes attended to facts. The case itself, as Holmes said to me on the last evening, was one of the simpler ones in its structure. The crime was not complicated. The motive was clear. The mechanism was elegant in the way that someone like Hollowell, who had made the administration of difficult problems his professional speciality, would produce elegant mechanisms. What made it interesting was everything around it. The 60 years of history that the crime sat on top of. The layers of relationship and obligation and fear that produced the moment in Harley Street on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The cases that interest me most, Holmes said once, and I believe this was true, are not the ones with the most complex crimes. The crime is usually straightforward once the motive is established. What interests me is the human machinery that produces the crime. The series of choices and circumstances and misunderstandings that arrive, eventually, at this specific point in time and space, where a person decides to do a terrible thing. That machinery is always more interesting than the terrible thing itself. In the Margrave case, the machinery ran back 60 years. It ran back to a mill owner's natural death and a young partner's decision to take what was available. It ran back to a young physician's first confrontation with a choice between integrity and safety, and the choice he made. It ran back through decades of payment and silence, and the quiet accumulation of everything neither man was saying. And then it ran forward again, to the moment when everything was finally running out. Carver dying, Margrave deciding to speak, the clock finally reaching zero on the arrangement that had lasted a working life, and produced, in that convergence of endings, a murder. The murder was the result. The machinery was the story. There is a time of night in London. It's around 2:30, perhaps 3 o'clock. When the city does something it only does when it thinks no one is watching. it goes almost quiet. Not truly quiet. London is never truly quiet. The river is always there. The trains are still running on some routes. The bakers are already at work. The newspaper print rooms are churning for the morning edition. But the full-throated human noise of the day, and even of the evening, has subsided, and what remains is the essential sound of the city at rest, the slow breath of 4 million sleeping people, and the work that continues in the dark on their behalf. I had been awake in those hours, in Baker Street. More than once, in the course of various cases, Holmes and I had worked together. There is something about that time that clarifies thinking in a way the daylight hours don't achieve. Or perhaps it's that the noise of daylight thinking subsides along with the noise of the city, and what remains is something closer to the actual shape of things. The actual shape of things, in the Margrave case, was this. A physician had died. He had been killed to prevent him from speaking. The person who ordered his killing was dying himself, and had made the decision to confess, because at the end of a life, the weight of what you have done sometimes becomes heavier than what you have to lose. The person who executed the killing had done it out of loyalty. Not the nobility kind, but the kind that forms between people who have spent 20 years working in the same direction. The kind that stops asking questions about whether the direction is right. And underneath all of that, an old theft. An opportunist taking advantage of a friend's death to take a little more than was his. A small crime in the scale of crimes. The thing that had launched 36 years of managed suffering and 60 years of protected guilt, and produced, eventually, a dead physician on a rainy Thursday in Harley Street. The city breathed in the dark. The clocks in the Baker Street sitting room counted their way through the small hours with the patient, reliable sound of things doing exactly what they were designed to do. I sat in Watson's chair and let the fire burn low, and let the night do what the night does to the thoughts of a day that has been longer than most. The actual shape of things in most situations is smaller than the story built around it, not less painful. The pain is real regardless of the scale of the crime, not less consequential. The consequences ripple outward as far as they ripple, regardless of what caused them, but smaller in itself. The original act, the first choice, the thing from which everything else grew, it is usually much smaller than the forest of its consequences. And here is what I always come back to, in the quiet hours. The decision to speak. The decision to say the difficult thing at the moment it needs to be said, rather than the moment it becomes unavoidable. The choice that Margrave didn't make in 1861, and that cost him everything. The choice that, if made, would have produced a different kind of difficulty, smaller, finite, survivable, rather than the 36-year version he instead chose to carry. It's always available, that choice, at almost any point along the way. The moment passes, another moment comes. The choice is still available. Sleep is, among other things, a rehearsal for trust. You can only sleep when you are willing to let go of the day's controls, to stop managing, stop monitoring, stop processing the stream of information that the waking world generates, and allow the body and the mind to do what they need to do without your conscious management of the process. You give up control and you trust the room, the house, the city, the basic machinery of the world, that it will still be there when you open your eyes. Most of what we carry through the day is weight we don't need to carry. Not all of it. Some of it is real and needs to be attended to and cannot be put down. But most of what makes the day heavy, the anxieties, the unresolved thoughts, the things we're turning over and over without resolution, most of that is not load-bearing. Most of that can be set down. Sleep is where you set it down. In the Baker Street sitting room at 3 in the morning, the fire is very low and the lamp is nearly out and the clocks are ticking, and Sherlock Holmes is asleep in his armchair with the violin across his lap and the ease of someone who has no anxiety about tomorrow because he trusts his own resources to meet it. The case is resolved. The work is done. The night is doing what the night does. And whatever you are carrying right now, in whatever room you are in whatever part of the world, whatever has been on your mind as the day wound down and the dark arrived, you can set it down now too. The room is warm. The fire is low. The city breathes. You are not the physician who carried his choice for 36 years. You are not the old man at the end of his life with 60 years of silence finally breaking open. You are someone in a warm, dark room, and the night is long and patient, and you have nothing to do for the next several hours except breathe and let the darkness carry you. Let it carry you. The clocks count. The fire dims. Holmes plays in his sleep, not with the violin, but in the way minds play in sleep, turning a phrase, resolving a chord, finding the version of something that was just out of reach during the day. And the city is enormous and various and entirely indifferent to any particular worry, and the night has been doing this for as long as there have been nights, and it is very good at it. Eleanor Fairfax's house in Kensington had been arranged over decades by someone with a clear sense of what mattered. Nothing was particularly expensive. Nothing was fashionable. Everything was chosen and kept. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed 3 generations of a family that had taken pictures seriously, as people did in the era when having a photograph taken was still an event. In the center of the arrangement, a cabinet portrait of a man who had Gerald Dunmore's dark coloring and something harder in his face than pride, something more like determination. "My grandfather," she said, noticing me looking. "Edgar Dunmore. That was taken in 1858. He died 3 years later." "A handsome man," I said. "He was a substantial man." She sat. Not just in the physical sense. He filled the space he occupied. My father used to say that when Edgar Dunmore walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around him. She looked at the portrait. He was 49 in that picture. He died at 58, 9 years. Your father admired him greatly. My father devoted his life to him, or to his memory, which is not quite the same thing. She folded her hands. Gerald Dunmore, my father, was the eldest son. He took the business seriously. He took the family seriously. And when the inquest returned its verdict and things appeared to be settled, he couldn't accept it. She was quiet for a moment. I grew up with the investigation. It was the furniture of my childhood, the way some children grow up with their father's hobby, stamps or fishing. My father's hobby was finding out what had really happened to Edgar Dunmore. He never found it, Holmes said. He died in 1889 with nothing resolved. He had accumulated an enormous amount of documentation about the inquest, about Carver, about Margrave. He knew Margrave had moved to London, had found the address, had written twice asking for an interview, which Margrave declined. He had nothing that proved anything. She looked at her hands. I inherited all the documentation. I've kept it because it was his life's work, not because I believed I'd ever find the answer. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Would you mind if I saw it? She looked at him with the clear, assessing gaze I had come to associate with people who have spent a long time navigating difficult situations. Are you telling me you found something? I'm telling you that what I've found may or may not align with what your father believed, Holmes said carefully. I would like to see the documentation before I give you my conclusions. The order matters." She rose. She was gone for about 10 minutes. When she returned, she was carrying a wooden box, substantial, well made, the kind that a man who takes an organized approach to things builds to contain them. She set it on the table. Inside were 3 folders of papers, bound with different colors of ribbon to indicate different periods or categories of investigation. A set of newspaper clippings, neatly trimmed and pasted. Several letters, the ones to Margrave presumably, and perhaps replies from his solicitor. A series of photographs of official documents, taken at close range with some precision. And a large folded sheet that, when unfolded, turned out to be a hand-drawn diagram showing the Dunmore business relationships as Gerald had understood them. The partnership with Carver, the financial flows, the dates of key transactions. Holmes went through the box with the systematic efficiency of someone reading a text for information. He did not rush, but he did not linger. Each document was examined, noted, and replaced. "Your father was thorough," he said, after perhaps 20 minutes. "He had nothing else to put his thoroughness toward," she said, with a quality of sorrow that was not self-pity, but something more resigned. He was a competent businessman. He ran the mill adequately, but his real occupation was this. He was right that there was something to find, Holmes said. He was right that Margrave knew more than he testified. He was right that Carver was involved. He set down the last document. He was wrong about the murder. She was very still. "Your grandfather died of cardiac failure," Holmes said. The death certificate was accurate. He said it directly, without preamble, in the way he delivered difficult information. Not unkindly, but without softening, that would require her to ask clarifying questions. What Carver did was use the period of disruption following the death to divert business funds. What Margrave did was observe this and accept payment to remain silent. Both crimes were real, but the death itself was natural. She sat with this for a long time. "My father," she said at last, "spent 30 years believing his grandfather was murdered." Yes. He would have spent those 30 years differently if he had known the truth. He might have. Holmes paused. Or he might have replaced the murder investigation with a financial fraud investigation, which would have been equally difficult to prove without Margrave's cooperation. The difficulty of proving Carver's crime was real, independent of the murder theory. She looked at the wooden box. He died not knowing. He did. Another long quiet. "Is it easier?" she said. "The truth? Is it easier than the story?" Holmes considered this with genuine care. "The truth is different," he said. "The weight of it is different. Whether it is easier depends entirely on what you do with it." He looked at her steadily. "What I can tell you is that the truth does not require you to continue doing what your father did. It closes the question. Whether that closing is a relief or a loss is something only you can determine." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "That is an honest answer." "It is the only kind I have," he said. Holmes was not finished with the investigation at this point. There remained the question of what exactly Carver had used against Margrave, the nature of the leverage that had started the arrangement in 1861. For this, he made one more inquiry. He sent a telegram to an associate in Leeds, one of the network of contacts he maintained in cities across Britain, people who could access local records and memories with the efficiency of familiarity. The reply came within hours. He read it at the Baker Street table and was quiet for a moment. "Edinburgh, 1855, he said. "Margrave was a student, 3rd year. There was a patient, a woman, a working-class woman, who came to the teaching hospital and died during a procedure that was, at the time, considered routine, but that would later be understood as carrying specific risks for patients with her particular history. He folded the telegram. The procedure was conducted by a group of students under supervision. Margrave was one of them. The woman's death was classified as the result of her pre-existing condition, but 2 witnesses, fellow students, signed a statement attesting that the procedure was conducted incorrectly and that Margrave specifically had made an error that a properly trained student would not have made. The statement was suppressed, I said. The statement was filed and not acted on. The hospital classified the death as natural causes related to the patient's condition and moved on. He set the telegram aside. Carver somehow acquired a copy of the statement, perhaps from one of the witnesses, perhaps from someone connected to the hospital administration. However he got it, he had it by 1862, when he used it against Margrave. A medical error from 7 years earlier, I said. An error that, if publicized, would have ended Margrave's career. In 1862, with the Medical Act newly passed and the profession working to establish its credibility, a documented allegation of student incompetence resulting in a patient's death would have been extremely damaging. Holmes looked at the fire. The statement was probably not as damning as Carver presented it. The interpretation of what happened in that Edinburgh teaching room would have been contested. But Margrave, at 26, didn't know that. He only knew that the statement existed, that Carver had it, and that Carver was willing to use it. A young man terrified of a document, I said. A young man terrified of a document that may or may not have been as dangerous as it appeared, Holmes said. That is the other element of what Carver did. He exploited Margrave's uncertainty. A man who was confident in his position might have called the bluff. Margrave was not confident. He had made an error. He knew he had made it, regardless of whether the official record showed it. And the error had produced a woman's death. That weight was already there before Carver arrived. He stood. This is the mechanism of blackmail at its most refined, he said. The effective blackmailer does not need to have material that would definitively destroy the target. They need material that the target believes is dangerous enough to avoid having tested. The uncertainty is the weapon. He moved to the window. Carver did not know whether the Edinburgh statement would have actually destroyed Margrave's career. Margrave did not know either. And in the space of that shared uncertainty, 36 years of payment was billed. There is a particular quality to the evening before a case resolves that I have come to recognize across many cases and many places. It is not tension exactly. It is more like the quality of a piece of music approaching its final resolution. The harmonic tension built up over many bars beginning to lean toward the chord that will release it. That evening, the Baker Street sitting room had that quality. Holmes was at the chemical bench, not working. The case did not require further chemical analysis, but standing near it in the way he sometimes stood near things he found useful, as if proximity to the instrument of thought was itself a form of thinking. He had the Carver file in his hand. He was reading it. I was at the window. The rain had finally stopped. The street below was gleaming and empty, each gas lamp a perfect amber circle on the black, wet stones. A cab moved through the far end of the street, its horse's breath making small clouds in the cold air. Someone walked quickly past on the pavement below, coat pulled close, hat down, hurrying towards somewhere warmer. "Tell me something," I said. Holmes set down the file. "Ask it." "The note," I said. "The supposed suicide note." You said the handwriting was authentic because it was copied from Margrave's journal. But you also said Margrave was writing something different on the day he died. The pen had fresh ink. He'd been working on something that morning. I turned from the window. What was he writing? Holmes picked up his pipe. Something he didn't finish, he said. The document that would have constituted his formal statement. The account he intended to give the police. He had begun it that afternoon. It was taken from the desk when whoever entered the room cleaned up the evidence. He paused. We know he was writing it because the nib of his pen had fresh ink. We know it was removed because it wasn't in the room. What it said, we cannot recover. But he had started, I said. He had started. Holmes looked at the fire. He had sat down that afternoon, with his 4 o'clock appointment cancelled and his afternoon free, and he had taken a sheet of paper and he had begun to write out what he knew. After 36 years, he had finally begun. And then Hollowell came through the window. And then Hollowell came through the window. He drew on the pipe. The timing is almost perfectly terrible. Another hour, perhaps, and Margrave might have produced a document that would have made the case straightforward. But the timing was not another hour. It was the specific afternoon when the arrangement finally broke down and Carver moved. I turned back to the window. He was so close, I said. He was years late, Holmes said, but not harshly. He had 36 years in which to begin that document. He began it on the day it cost him everything to begin it. He was quiet for a moment. That is not a criticism. It is an acknowledgement of how difficult it is to reverse a course that has been set for a very long time. The momentum of a life is a real force. Changing direction requires effort that most people, most of the time, do not apply. He set down the pipe. When someone finally does change direction, he said, after a very long time in the wrong one, that matters. The fact that Margrave was finally doing it matters, even though he didn't live to complete it. The decision was made. The pen was in his hand. The direction had changed. He looked at me steadily. The change was not rewarded in this case. That is not always how it works. But the change itself was real, and it was significant. The clocks measured the distance between those words and the next. I think, Holmes said, that you should sleep. Not yet, I said. No, he agreed. Not yet. He went to the sofa and picked up his violin. He played for perhaps half an hour. A series of studies, scales and arpeggios, and then something more substantial. A piece I recognized vaguely as Elgar's, but couldn't place precisely. The notes moved through the room with the particular quality that Holmes's playing had in those late evening hours. Not performance, exactly, but presence. The violin as a kind of thinking. The music working through things the language of the case couldn't quite reach. At some point the rain started again. A light patter against the window, gentle, not insistent. The kind of rain that belongs in the late part of an evening rather than the main event. London was going to sleep, or as much of it as ever went to sleep. The street below was quieter. The gas lamp at the corner of Baker Street made its steady amber circle on the wet stones. Holmes set down the violin. Tomorrow, he said, Hollowell is arrested and Carver is charged, and the case is administratively complete. What will take longer is the legal proceeding, and longer still is whatever Mrs. Fairfax does with the truth about her grandfather, and longer still is whatever history eventually makes of Theodore Margrave, which is probably not much, because most histories are made of larger things than a physician in Harley Street, who carried a choice for 36 years and finally tried to put it down. He looked at the fire. But it is worth knowing, he said, that he tried. London in November is a city of interiors. The exterior, the streets, the parks, the great public spaces, is still present, still functioning, still being inhabited by the people who have no choice but to be in it. But the quality of the exterior has changed. The days are short, the light is thin and grey, the rain is persistent, and so the interior life of the city expands to compensate. The public houses are fuller, the theatres are fuller, the private drawing rooms see more use, and every lit window in every street is a small signal of a world being conducted inside, away from the wet and the cold and the dark that come too early. In those interiors across the city, the ordinary machinery of human life runs on, the arguments and the reconciliations, the business letters written and the dinner invitations issued, the medical appointments kept in Harley Street and in less grand establishments elsewhere by people carrying their various private concerns to someone with the training and the authority to receive them. The newspapers read, the fires tended, the clocks wound by the thousands of hands that maintained London's timepieces against the entropy that the damp November air was always working toward. In the Baker Street sitting room, one more fire burning, one more lamp casting its pool of amber light on the familiar disorder of a working intelligence at rest. One more evening in which the day's events were processed and stored, and the machinery of tomorrow prepared. This is what happens in cities, every night, in every weather, in every season. The vast human enterprise of continuing, of maintaining the structures and the habits and the relationships and the knowledge that make the next day possible. It is invisible and essential and almost never remarked upon. Holmes wound his own clocks. He kept 3, each set to a different reference, part of a professional habit relating to precision timing in the observation of events, and turned down the lamp and went to bed. The Baker Street clocks ticked in the dark. The city breathed. The rain said whatever rain says against the window in November when the night is long. Sleep is the city's gift to itself. Every night, across the enormous organism of London, the work of the day is set down, and the body's own maintenance work begins. The bone and muscle and nerve, which have been running the public face of the self since morning, turn inward to their own requirements. The mind, freed from the management of the day, begins its different work, the sorting, the consolidating, the making sense of what was taken in. You are part of that. You are part of the vast breathing in of a city or a town or a place that goes quiet at this hour. The collective agreement to stop for a while and let the night have what the night requires. Whatever you have been carrying through this evening, the thought that wouldn't resolve, the thing you've been turning over, the weight that accumulated over the day's hours, you can set it down now, not throw it away. Just set it down for the hours between now and morning, because carrying it into sleep means carrying it through the night, and the night has no use for it. The fire is low. The clocks count. The window is dark. Holmes is asleep in the Baker Street flat, and Watson is in Portsmouth. And somewhere across the city, Mrs. Fairfax is sitting with the new shape of her grandfather's story and deciding what to do with it. And Thomas Carver is in his Chelsea house with the knowledge of everything he has done arranged around him like furniture in a room he will soon be leaving. And you are here, warm and quiet and held by whatever holds us in the dark. Let the clocks count you toward morning. Let the night do its work. You can trust it with this. Sleep gently, dear traveller. The fire is very low now. The city breathes. Until next time.